He trusted her until he saw her in another city. But what happened next turned everything upside down. James sat in a cafe, watching his friends joke and laugh, casually sipping their beers. He remained silent, listening to their conversations, giving them his full attention, though his thoughts were far away. Laura, his wife, hadn't been herself lately. Their married life had been different for months now, colder, more distant. She seemed like she was running from something, though he couldn't figure out what. This cafe used to be their spot, a place where they spent evenings together laughing and sharing updates about the kids, work, or just life in general. But today, James couldn't shake off the look in Laura's eyes, her cold indifference. She was changing week by week, and he couldn't understand why. He tried to rationalize her behavior. Maybe it was just a midlife crisis, work stress, or exhaustion. But everything pointed to her being emotionally distant, as if an invisible wall had formed between them. Laura had also been staying late at work more often or finding other things to keep her busy, leaving their evenings at home feeling almost empty. When they did spend time together, she seemed absent. Sometimes James noticed her lingering on her phone, and when he approached, she quickly hid the screen or changed the subject. At first, he tried to ignore it, but over time, these small moments began to form a bigger picture that made him question her honesty and loyalty. Even then, he tried to hold on to hope. James was an optimist by nature, and though doubts gnawed at him, he still believed this was just a temporary misunderstanding or a small gap in their relationship. They had been together for 10 years, and their children, Alice and Anthony, were their pride and joy. He couldn't believe everything could fall apart so suddenly. That evening at the cafe, as they sat in their usual corner, James felt a strange tension in the air. His friend Ryan turned to him, seemingly casually, but with an uncertain expression on his face. "You know, James," Ryan began, "I heard something interesting. I don't want you to worry, but you're Laura. Someone saw her in another city with some guy. I don't know if it's just a coincidence or something more, but I thought I should tell you," he said, taking a sip of his beer. James felt his chest tighten, his heart raced, and his thoughts spiraled. Laura? In another city? With someone else? He didn't know how to respond. He sat silently, staring at Ryan, trying to process what he had just heard. "Are you sure?" James asked quietly, trying not to reveal his surprise and growing anxiety. His voice sounded strange even to himself, as if he wasn't sure why he had asked. Maybe it was just a rumor? Maybe Ryan had the wrong information? But something felt off. "Yes, I saw them myself. I can't say for sure what was going on, but it definitely didn't look like just a casual meeting," Ryan said, locking eyes with James. James was still trying to keep his composure, but anger and a whirlwind of emotions flared inside him. It was hard for him to believe that his wife could behave this way. She had always been a caring mother, a devoted wife. How could she simply betray him like that? He couldn't imagine it. "I don't think it's anything serious, Ryan. It's probably just a misunderstanding," James replied, trying to calm himself down. He didn't want to believe the worst, as it would be a devastating blow for him. He couldn't picture how this would change everything if it turned out to be true. The evening went on, but James couldn't shake off what he had heard. His thoughts kept circling back to Ryan's words, and within minutes, he decided to head home, even though he wasn't sure how to handle the situation. Should he confront Laura right away? Or could this just be a minor incident, not worth blowing out of proportion? In his car, waves of anxiety washed over him again and again. At home, he pictured Laura, how she looked while working, doing her own things. But how did she act around him? Had she truly grown so distant? Or was it just his imagination fueled by rumors? James couldn't figure out if there was any truth to it, or if it was all in his head. When he walked into the house, Laura was already there, sitting on the couch with her phone in hand, completely absorbed in whatever she was doing. She didn't even seem to notice him come in. "Laura," James said quietly as he sat down next to her. He tried to speak calmly, but his heart was pounding, as if something inside him was fracturing. "Did you hear what I found out today?" She looked up, her face showing an expression James couldn't quite read. It was something between surprise and worry. Laura put her phone down and turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "Ryan said he saw you in another city with some guy," James said softly, watching her reaction closely. Laura froze for a moment, but then quickly lost her composure. Are you seriously listening to him again? She snapped, glaring at him. It means nothing. Don't start with your suspicions again, James. But there was something else in her voice, a hint of dishonesty. James sat on the couch, watching Laura, who was trying to mask her anger and nervousness after hearing his question. There was a stubbornness in her eyes that he knew all too well. He had seen it during their debates over vacation plans, or deciding who would stay home with the kids. It was part of her character. She could always prioritize herself, but she had always been honest and straightforward. Yet today, something was different. Do you really think I could betray you? Laura's voice was quiet, even a bit strained, as if she were trying to convince herself that it was impossible. James observed her reaction closely, searching her eyes for any sign that this was just a mistake, a misunderstanding. Laura slowly lifted her gaze. Her expression was calm, but there was an invisible tension in that calmness. James couldn't pinpoint exactly what seemed unnatural in her demeanor, but he felt it wasn't just tears or indignation. It was something else. And then she replied, I didn't cheat on you, James. It wasn't me. You're trying to catch me in something that doesn't exist. It's just gossip, you know? She sounded convincing, and for a moment, James felt his heart ease. Her words, though not entirely natural, gave him a sliver of hope. He tried to dismiss the thoughts planted in his mind by Ryan's words and convince himself that it was all just a misunderstanding, that perhaps he was mistaken. James leaned slightly forward, his gaze attentive but still somewhat bewildered. Laura, I don't know. It all feels so real. You couldn't have missed how much you've changed lately. This isn't just gossip. I don't want to think poorly of you, but these words won't let me rest. He clasped his hands, trying to contain his rising anxiety, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't ready to believe this could be true. Something was wrong with what he had heard. Something didn't fit the picture, but he couldn't explain what it was. Laura looked at him for several seconds, her face showing a mix of irritation and disappointment. She felt trapped, knowing that while James believed in her, he couldn't rid himself of the nagging sense that something wasn't right. He couldn't accept the idea of losing his wife's faithfulness because, for him, that was the foundation of their relationship, trust. Trust that it was impossible to betray the person with whom he had spent so many years, built a family, raised children, and overcome life's challenges. She knew this, and so she responded, striving to appear as calm as possible, though internally she was in turmoil. James, don't be so naive. I love you, and you know that. I could never betray you. We've been together for so long, and I'd never want to lose you over something so trivial. This is just a coincidence. She said it without much emotional strain, but James felt her words pierce his heart. Laura had always been like that, always confident, always reasonable and composed. That's why he closed his eyes for a moment to deal with the wave of doubt. You're right. I don't think you could betray me, Laura, he said, taking a deep breath and finally letting go of the burden of suspicion. It was hard for him to believe it could be true. All his instincts, his moral compass, told him he couldn't think that way about his wife. He still loved her, and he felt that if it were true, his world would simply collapse. She was his everything, his support, his friend, his partner, and so his soul refused to believe in the possibility of betrayal. Laura noticed the change in his gaze. Instead of continuing to defend herself, she finally exhaled and felt the tension in her body ease slightly. She was relieved he wasn't continuing his attack. What had recently seemed to her like an endless, playful look was now filled with deep emotional pain. James, I swear to you, I could never do something like that. I don't want to lose you. You are my world. You have to believe me. She touched his hand, and despite the unbearable pain he felt, James, though his heart continued to race, gradually began to relax. He could feel her hand on his, warm and familiar. He inhaled deeply and looked into her eyes, trying to find even the faintest hint of a lie, even the slightest sign of insincerity. But there was nothing. She was firm in her conviction, and he couldn't detect any trace of deception in her words. I want to believe you, Laura. It's just that I can't fathom that you could deceive me. We've been through so much together, We have two wonderful children. How could this happen? How could you do something like that? James asked again, and his voice carried a pain that couldn't be hidden. He couldn't even entertain the thought that this might be true. To him, it was like a terrible dream, something so impossible that it couldn't happen in their life. His heart refused to accept even the idea of betrayal. "I don't want you to doubt me, James," Laura replied, her voice filled with sorrow. She, too, seemed to sense how hard this was for him to accept, but her words carried convincing honesty. "Give me a chance to prove that I haven't betrayed you. We'll get through this together. I love you. Just you and me." Time passed, and though Laura assured James of her innocence, it became increasingly difficult for him to ignore the subtle changes in her behavior. She was no longer the same woman he once knew. In recent months, a certain detachment had appeared in her gaze, and her late returns from work had become routine. James tried to explain it away as work-related difficulties, but deep down, something whispered to him that the problem wasn't just that. He wasn't naive enough to overlook how Laura seemed to drift further away with each passing day. These thoughts haunted him, and though he tried not to voice them, he increasingly found himself hiding his suspicions from even himself. He couldn't and didn't want to believe that his wife could betray him, but he felt more and more that something was wrong in their relationship. The worst part was that his suspicions were echoed by his friends. Ryan, one of his old friends, once casually mentioned during a meeting at the bar that he had seen Laura in another city with a man James had never met before. At first, James dismissed it, thinking it was just another joke. But then Ryan brought it up again, and James felt his heart clench painfully. He began to realize that something wasn't right. This couldn't just be a coincidence. Every time Laura came home late, James started to grow anxious. He tried not to let it show, to keep his doubts hidden, but the thoughts wouldn't leave him alone. He wanted to talk to her about it, but he was afraid that voicing his suspicions would be the end of everything they had built together. What if it wasn't true? So, he decided to stay silent, to observe and gather more evidence before broaching such a heavy subject. One day, when Laura left for the store, James decided to check her car. He knew it might not be fair, but his inner uncertainty drove him to act this way. He tried to convince himself it was just about checking her driver's documents, though deep down, he knew he was searching for something more. While inspecting the car, he noticed something that made his heart stop: a white substance on the back seat. At first, James couldn't figure out what it was. It looked like dried liquid and had an unpleasant smell, and he couldn't precisely identify it. The thought that it might be related to drugs crossed his mind, and his heart broke at the idea that his wife could be involved in something like that. But as he looked closer, he saw something else: a condom lying on the car floor. The white substance and the condom together immediately made him question his belief in Laura's honesty. The few seconds James spent standing in the car, shocked by his discovery, felt like an eternity. His hands began to tremble, and he didn't know what to do next. Should he confront her right away? But then he remembered her words: "It's not me." He couldn't jump to conclusions. What if it was all just a coincidence? What if there was another explanation for it, something completely different from what he was imagining? He started doubting his own conclusions. His instinct screamed that something was wrong, but his logic urged him to wait. He gathered the substance and the condom into a small bag and hid it in his briefcase. He planned to keep observing before revealing anything. He couldn't simply ask Laura about it without solid proof. The doubts were hard to bear, but he couldn't go against his nature, his belief in their relationship. He and Laura had always talked through everything, always worked things out together. How could he believe this was infidelity? How could this happen? And yet, he felt more and more like he was bracing for a storm he wasn't prepared to face. He couldn't understand why Laura had changed, why she had begun to drift away, why her words no longer sounded as sincere as they once did, why it had become so difficult for her to come home. He started replaying every little detail, every gesture, every word she had said in recent months, trying to find a logical explanation. All those moments began to form a single picture, and though he didn't want to believe it, his heart told him he was uncovering the truth. In the days following his discovery, James refrained from taking any action. He didn't want to provoke a conflict or push Laura further away, but he felt his patience wearing thin. He started thinking about what to do next. He saw himself as a man who wanted to preserve his family, who wanted to believe in his wife. But his heart couldn't ignore the truth it was beginning to see. Over the next few days, he became more cautious and attentive to every movement Laura made, every phrase she said, every moment they shared. He searched for answers to questions he couldn't yet articulate, and when he eventually learned that Laura was planning another trip to the city Ryan had mentioned, his heart trembled with uneasy certainty. Laura had just stepped through the door when James heard it creak open. He was sitting in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring out the window. The whole time she'd been at work, his thoughts had circled around what he had found in her car. The sight of the white substance in the condom felt like a punch to the gut. And though he tried convincing himself it could all be a misunderstanding, every small change in her behavior over the past few months only deepened his doubts. This morning, he decided he could no longer live with these questions. But when he heard her footsteps in the hallway, everything inside him fell silent for a moment. He felt a strange excitement, as if a part of him, dulled by worry and anxiety, had come alive when Laura returned. She entered the room, and James saw her. Laura stood in front of the mirror, holding a new dress she was trying on, with new lingerie laid out on the bed beside her. James couldn't help but notice her appearance. She was stunning. Every movement was filled with elegance, and even the room, infused with the scent of her perfume, seemed somehow transformed. Laura looked like a goddess, and James couldn't take his eyes off her. In these moments, he forgot all his doubts, all the questions swirling in his mind. "Wow, you're incredible," James said, stepping closer. His voice betrayed the emotions he was trying to suppress as he admired her flawless figure in the new outfit. Laura smiled back at him, but her smile felt cold, lacking warmth. She turned to the mirror and adjusted the dress that barely touched her body. "Thank you," she said without looking at him. "You know, I need to look perfect today." James heard those words, and the unease crept back into his heart. It seemed as though something in her voice, in her gaze, had grown colder. What was it? He couldn't figure it out. Laura picked up a black garter belt from the bed and began carefully fastening it. "Where are you going?" James asked, unable to hold back. Laura shot him a quick glance and, without stopping, replied, "I have an important meeting, James. You know how much I work, don't you?" He stood there, watching as she adjusted the garter and pulled it snug around her hips. He couldn't help but notice how her movements had become more graceful, how she herself seemed more alluring and elegant. "And this is what you're wearing to the meeting?" James asked, stepping closer to the bed where the black stockings lay. "It's very revealing, Laura." She turned to him, her eyes no longer as kind as they once were. There was a hint of weariness in her gaze, and her voice grew colder. "What's wrong with it?" she replied, continuing to adjust the belt. "I have to look elegant, mysterious. It's an important part of the image, James. I can't always be simple, can I?" James fell silent for a moment, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. His heart clenched with a tangle of unspoken emotions. "This is so vulgar, Laura," he said, trying to sound calm, though inside him, anger and fear battled for control. Laura laughed, tossing her hair back, then, with a serious expression, responded, "Vulgar? Really? James, you don't want me to look like just some housewife, do you? I have to be a successful woman, and sometimes that means dressing the part." James felt his fists clench involuntarily. He wanted to shout, to finally ask the question that had haunted him for weeks, but he couldn't. Instead, he simply said, "I don't understand why you've changed so much. You used to be different." Laura didn't reply immediately. She looked at him again in the mirror, then slowly raised her eyes to meet his. "You know I've always wanted more. I'm more than just a mom and a wife, James. You don't listen to me. You want me to stay home with the kids while you focus on your career? I need to achieve something too." The sharpness of her voice and the indifference on her face stung James deeply. It wasn't just her detachment that hurt. It was the way she spoke about it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "But I want you at home with us, Laura. We're a family. You can't just leave everything as it is," he said, striving to keep his voice steady. Laura shrugged. her expression tinged with disdain as she glanced at him. That's your opinion. Mine is that I need to work and make money. You can stay home with the kids. That's your role, James. She turned back to the mirror, leaving him standing there, struggling to collect his thoughts. Her words hit him like a tidal wave, and he couldn't understand where they had lost the connection they once shared, or if it could ever be restored. The silence following her statement was abruptly broken by the sound of her phone ringing. Laura quickly went to her bag, sat on the bed, and answered. Yes, I'll be there in half an hour, she said, her voice cool and self-assured, as if these words were now part of her new, unattainable persona. James stood, watching her carefree demeanor, feeling as though everything inside him was unraveling. Smiling, Laura gathered her things and left the room, leaving James standing by the bed where she had just been. His heart pounded as though it sensed he was teetering on the edge of something monumental and irreversible. Once the door closed behind her, he was alone. The room felt empty, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation. James sat on the edge of the bed, realizing that his questions remained unanswered, while the doubts that had arisen after what he'd discovered only deepened. He couldn't erase the memory of what he'd found in her car, the white powder, the condom. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to believe that his wife, his Laura, could be capable of betrayal. What happened to her? How did their harmony suddenly shatter? James sat there, lost in these questions, trying to figure out where and why he had missed the signs that now seemed so obvious. He felt that something had been changing every day, but he couldn't pinpoint the moment they lost their connection. Yesterday, she was still his Laura, the woman with whom he had planned his life. But today, her appearance, her words, her indifference, they all felt alien. Laura once again looked like she had when they first met, beautiful, desirable, but also unattainable. And now, watching her as she prepared to leave, James felt his heart ache. How long had it been since he last saw her like this? So beautiful, so alluring, as on the day they first met. She had always been beautiful, but not in this way. James couldn't recall the last time he had seen such a sparkle in her eyes, or when she had taken such meticulous care of herself. It came as a shock to him. He wanted to talk to her, to ask why she had changed, why her words and actions had become so distant, so unpredictable. He longed to spend time with her, to have a conversation, to understand why she was so cold now. But all he got was a cold glance and her eagerness to leave. He felt his hands grow heavy, and breathing became difficult. James sat in silence for several minutes, trying to calm himself so he wouldn't show his emotions when Laura left the house. He got up from the bed and went to the window, watching as her car disappeared around the corner. Now that Laura was gone, he felt not just confusion but a profound sense of loneliness that overtook him every time she distanced herself. He had often felt this way in recent months, but today it was different, worse, more painful. He wanted her. He wanted her to be with him. But Laura seemed to have lost interest in him. She no longer looked at him the way she used to. And while James still saw beauty in her, he couldn't feel the closeness, the warmth they had once shared. The realization of this difference hit him like a slap, leaving him unable to comprehend what was happening. Her new look, her clothing, her style, it all felt so foreign that he couldn't adjust to it. It seemed she was no longer the Laura he had once dreamed of building a family with, the Laura who had been his best, his beloved. Before him now stood another woman. Not the one he loved, not the one he knew. He felt as if he hadn't seen her like this in a long time. In those stockings and the garter belt, in that dress that accentuated every inch of her body. At that moment, James felt tears welling up in his eyes. He closed them tightly, taking a deep breath, trying to suppress his emotions. But it didn't help. The tears came anyway. Tears of pain and a deep sense of betrayal. Why had she changed? What had happened to the woman he once loved? What had happened to him? James felt his heart shatter with every thought racing through his mind. He cried, but these weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of a desperate attempt to understand what had happened to his life. She had left, and he couldn't hold her back. He couldn't bring her back. He felt like he was losing her, and it was the most painful moment of his life. Laura had left for an important meeting, as she claimed, but to James, it felt like a choice between him and something he couldn't understand. He couldn't fathom why she was off to this meeting again, why she spent so much time away from home, and why she seemed so distant. It hurt him to want to be with her while she continued to venture into another world, a world that didn't seem to have space for him anymore. But it wasn't her world anymore. It was a world where she alone decided what and whom to choose. James sat in his car, watching the streetlights blur through the window. He closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart. He knew that today might be the moment when everything changed, the moment he would either confirm his worst fears or realize that his suspicions were nothing but figments of his imagination. But the unknown was even scarier than betrayal itself. Laura had said she was going to an important exhibition in another city. He could have just trusted her, but everything he had experienced in recent weeks wouldn't let him rest. He had already noticed her behavior becoming more and more detached, and the more he tried to understand her, the more doubts arose. His friends had managed to find out that the exhibition was being held in a prestigious venue, attracting many important people. If she won't tell me why she can't stay home, I'll figure it out myself, James thought. He decided to leave the kids for a few hours and go see what was really happening at this venue. Perhaps this was his chance to uncover the truth. With a determined raise of his brow, he opened the car door and stepped out. The city he had come to was large, filled with skyscrapers, neon-lit streets, and people moving briskly as if everything around them was urgent. As James approached the venue, he could feel his legs trembling slightly. What was he doing? Was he chasing something that might not even exist? The venue was breathtaking. Enormous chandeliers hung from high ceilings, reflecting off the black marble floors. The faint first notes of music, laughter, and conversation created an atmosphere that was both tense and captivating. People in expensive suits and elegant women in sparkling dresses, their branded bags hanging by their sides, filled the room. James listened as their conversations intertwined softly, the refined scents of perfumes and expensive drinks filling the air. This place isn't for me, he thought, feeling momentarily out of place and uncomfortable amidst this elite crowd. Gathering his courage, he took a few deep breaths and began walking further into the room, trying to appear casual, though his thoughts were entirely focused on Laura. He scanned the crowd, searching for her without drawing attention to himself. With each step, his heart pounded harder. What if he made a mistake? What if it wasn't what he thought? Then suddenly, he saw her. Laura stood by a large display, engaged in conversation with a man. James observed her from a distance, unwilling to come closer. Laura looked stunning. Her dress, which accentuated her figure, and her perfectly styled hair made her resemble a celebrity. James couldn't take his eyes off her, but there was something more, something intangible, that kept him rooted to the spot, subconsciously trying to grasp what was happening. And then, suddenly, he saw it. The man Laura was talking to was pudgy, with an unflattering haircut, but he exuded confidence. James hesitated for a moment, then looked back at them. They were laughing, exchanging words, and suddenly, the man leaned in toward Laura, and then, as if in slow motion, James saw them kiss. It wasn't a casual kiss on the cheek or a friendly greeting. It was a passionate kiss, a kiss on the lips. Laura didn't push him away, didn't recoil. She kissed him back as if it was her choice, as if she was comfortable with it. James couldn't believe his eyes. It was too much. His heart skipped a beat from the shock and pain. He couldn't believe this was really happening. How? Why? This couldn't be true. Confused and hurt, he couldn't bring himself to approach them right away. He stayed still, frozen in place. Laura and the man continued talking, then laughing, and the kiss seemed like a natural part of their conversation, as if it wasn't something forbidden or strange. James decided to do what he feared the most, take a photo. He hid his phone in his hands, took a few steps back, and caught the moment when Laura was in the man's embrace. It was a risky move, but he had no other choice. He couldn't afford to back down. The photo was taken, but now James could feel his hands trembling. He still couldn't believe what he had seen. His urge to ask her what was happening was mixed with disappointment and pain. But now everything was clear. This moment had changed everything. James stood still, his heart heavy as a stone. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. No, this couldn't be real. It just wasn't possible. He felt his hands shake, his mind trying to find a way out of this disturbing reality. Suddenly, a security guard approached him. A tall man with a serious expression, dressed in a black suit. James felt his chest tighten. He had the feeling that even if he asked for just a minute, he would still have to leave. The guard didn't seem either impressed or friendly. "Sorry, but you can't be here," the guard said in a sharp tone. "This is a place for the elite. Your outfit doesn't meet the dress code." James paused for a moment. He was dressed in a regular suit, nothing too extravagant or special. But now, it all seemed completely irrelevant. "I understand, but I need to stay," he said, bitterness in his voice, looking at Laura, who was still standing by the man she had kissed. The guard, not allowing him to object, interrupted him. "Sorry, it's our rule. If you don't meet the standards, you need to leave," the guard said, casting a glance at James. But James couldn't leave. Thoughts were spinning in his head, refusing to let him be at peace. "Who is that man?" he asked, turning to the guard and pointing at the man who was standing next to Laura. The guard looked at him, then replied, "That's his boss, Mr. Kane. He controls everything here. He owns this hall, and he organizes all these events." "Are you not familiar with him?" the guard asked. James heard the words, but couldn't make sense of what was happening. The man Laura had kissed was an important figure in this world, and it made everything even more complicated for him. James's heart grew heavier, and tears filled his eyes. He couldn't control his emotions anymore. He simply stood there in silence, watching as Laura moved further away from him, and with her, all of his hopes. Noticing that James had started to cry, the guard began pushing him towards the exit. "Sorry, but you need to go. If you wish, you can contact the administration," he said roughly, not giving James a chance to resist. James didn't protest. He left the hall, following the guard, realizing that this was not the place for him anymore. After the doors closed behind him, he found himself on the street in the cold darkness. Sitting in his car, James felt isolated from everything happening around him. His heart was filled with disappointment and pain. He had been so close to the truth, but now all he could do was wait. He got into the car and followed the same path that Laura had taken. He felt both strange and clear-headed. His decision was simple: follow her. He couldn't let her slip away from his hands, even if it meant getting lost in a new city. Time dragged slowly as James, with his hand on the wheel, followed Laura from a distance. She was heading to the park, and James realized she shouldn't be there. Why now? Why with him? When their car stopped near the park, James began to feel even more anxious. He stopped on the opposite side of the road, watching what was happening. He waited but couldn't figure out what to do. He didn't know if he should approach, or just leave things as they were. Unable to resist, James got out of the car. He quietly began walking on the sidewalk, getting closer to Laura's car. He felt each step bringing him closer to the unpleasant truth he didn't want to face. And then, when he got close to the car, he saw what had happened. Laura was sitting in the car with the same man, and he saw the betrayal with his own eyes. James couldn't bear it anymore and just walked away. He didn't say a word. He couldn't say anything. Laura was so focused on her partner that she didn't even notice James standing nearby. He turned back to his car and sat down. His heart was breaking, and he couldn't hold back the tears. He started the engine and drove home, crying the whole way. When James arrived home, his heart was beating unevenly, and he still couldn't recover from what he had seen at the exhibition. The feeling of pain and betrayal wouldn't leave him, but he tried not to let it consume him completely. He came home as if nothing had happened, trying to keep up the appearance of normality for the kids. He made them dinner, talked about everyday things, and asked how their day had been. Then, he kissed them goodnight and tucked them into bed. But as soon as the door to their room closed, James felt empty. All these emotions, this pain, wouldn't let go. He knew he had to process it somehow, but he couldn't find the answers to his questions. James wasn't sure if he even wanted to see her again. He didn't know what to do next. Unable to leave it unanswered, James decided to go to the shared bedroom. At first, he didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he felt he needed to look through her things. Maybe it would give him some clue, something he had been searching for. He entered the bedroom and began looking through her belongings, replaying the recent events in his mind. His heart was still heavy, and every step through the room seemed irrational. First, he approached her dresser. He pulled open a drawer, and in front of him was a neatly organized collection of her clothes, dresses, tops, skirts. But something caught his attention. He opened another shelf and found new lingerie. No, this wasn't the usual lingerie he had seen before. These were beautiful sets, ones he had never seen in her wardrobe. Black lace panties, elegant stockings, a garter belt for them. He felt his chest tighten with pain. Laura had never worn anything like this before. He continued examining her things. On the shelf were cosmetics that hadn't been there before. Expensive perfumes she had never bought. James felt a throbbing headache, and his heart was racing wildly. He couldn't believe he was finding all of this here. All these little things were like a signal from Laura that everything wasn't as he had imagined. But what confused him the most was something else. On the same shelf, he found a small box. James carefully opened it, and inside was a set of new jewelry. Serious gold earrings, a bracelet, and a necklace. Everything was very elegant, refined, and obviously expensive. For whom? He wondered, unable to stop the question that raised even more doubts. Did all of this mean anything? Or was it just a phase in her life? He couldn't find the answer. All these things were new, and he found it hard to believe she could have bought them with her own money. James began asking himself, has Laura really not been the person I thought she was for a long time? His mind was clouded. With each new thing, he felt everything he knew about his wife starting to crumble. Had she been someone else? That day when he saw her with another man now seemed like just a part of a bigger picture. James could no longer bear it. He couldn't leave it unanswered. His hands trembled as he closed the dresser and sat back down on the bed. He felt empty, exhausted, broken. The pain he felt was so sharp that he could hardly breathe. But in that moment, he realized that it was impossible to just forget what had happened. Something had changed forever. And even if Laura came home later, he wouldn't know how to look at her the same way. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen at the exhibition, how her body had been so close to that man. Those kisses, that look, all of it couldn't be erased from his memory. James felt as if his life was falling apart before his eyes. He could feel his world being shattered, his family breaking into pieces, and all he had to do was decide whether he wanted to try to save it or just leave it as it was. What he had found among Laura's things was just the beginning of what would force him to make the difficult decision. James woke up early, not even realizing when he had fallen asleep. His head felt heavy on the pillow, and his eyes were red from the tears he had shed the night before. Laura was already home, stepping out of the bathroom in a bathrobe, looking calm, even smiling. She acted as though she had spent the night at home, but James knew the truth. He said nothing. He silently sat at the kitchen table, holding a cup of coffee that he had made himself. Laura, as if nothing had happened, sat across from him, but her gaze was tense. James knew she had something on her mind, but he didn't want to start the conversation. The day passed as usual. Laura took care of the housework, the kids returned from school, and everything seemed almost normal. But in James's heart, a storm was raging. Every minute, he remembered what he had seen yesterday. Those kisses, that man, the park. He wanted to talk to her so badly, but he knew he wouldn't be able to keep it together and would explode. No, it needed to be done differently. He decided to wait until she said something. The next day, when the kids were at school, Laura approached James. She looked serious, even a little guilty. "We need to talk, James," she began, carefully sitting down on the couch across from him. James felt his heart tighten. Wasn't this the moment he had been waiting for so long? He nodded, signaling that he was ready to listen. Laura took a deep breath and then began. "I know that things have changed recently. You've probably noticed, and I want you to hear me. Completely. Without interruptions." James nodded again. He could barely breathe. "I've betrayed you," she said finally. Her words hit him like thunder on a clear day, even though he already knew the truth. He hadn't expected such bluntness. "With that man, the one you probably saw at the exhibition. It started a few months ago." James remained silent, but his hands gripped the armrests of the chair. He looked at her as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, and his reaction would decide whether she would fall. He is an influential person. My boss. He promised me help with my career, connections, money, everything I've wanted for a long time but was too afraid to ask for. James still said nothing. He could hardly hold back his tears. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was hurting you, even if you didn't know about it. But I couldn't stop. I felt like I finally had a chance to build something for myself, to not just be a wife and mother. And, James, her voice trembled, I knew you wouldn't understand this. I don't understand, James said quietly, but there was such tension in his voice that Laura flinched. You want me to understand why you betrayed me? You want me to forgive you for that? Laura shut her eyes, as if bracing for a blow. I want you to hear me, to understand why this happened. It's not because I don't love you. These words made James rise. He couldn't sit anymore. He walked to the window, not wanting her to see his eyes filling with tears again. You say you love me? He turned to her, his voice full of pain. How can you say that after everything? Laura stood up and walked toward him. James, listen to me. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I want to fix it. I want to come back to you, to our family. He shook his head, his voice quiet but determined. You think it's that easy? That you can betray me and come back as if nothing happened? No, she replied. I know it will be hard, but I'm ready to prove to you that I regret it, that it was a mistake, and that I want to be your wife again. James looked at her, and there was more pain in his eyes than Laura could bear. He stepped away from her again, as if her words were too heavy for him. I don't know if I can accept this, he finally said. But one thing I know for sure. You've already lost something important. You've lost my trust. And that's the hardest thing to regain. Laura was silent, understanding that James's words were true. But she decided not to give up. I'm willing to do anything for you to trust me again, she said. I want to start over. And if that means I have to earn it through hard work, I'm ready. James didn't answer. He turned back to the window, staring at the distant horizon, as if his salvation lay beyond the home. James sat in silence, feeling his life falling apart into pieces. Laura was pregnant, and she wasn't even sure who the father of the child was. This news was the final straw for him. He could no longer let his pain and betrayal control him. He decided to act, but this time, wisely. James knew he had to gather all possible evidence to expose the man. He went through Laura's messages on her phone, made copies of the photos he had taken himself, and even recorded a few conversations between Laura and her boss using a voice recorder he had slipped into her bag. After several days of painstaking work, he finally discovered that Laura's boss was Robert Kane Gray, an influential businessman who owned several companies. But the most interesting part was that Robert was married to Amanda Gray, one of the most influential women in the city. Her word carried weight even in political circles. Having gathered enough evidence, James decided to meet with Amanda. It was a risky move, but he felt she deserved to know the truth. Mrs. Gray, he began when they met at a cozy cafe. I understand this may shock you, but your husband is not the man you think he is. At first, Amanda wanted to walk away from the conversation, but when James showed her the photos and recordings, her face changed. The calmness was replaced with cold fury. Thank you for telling me this, she said, maintaining control over her emotions. I know how to handle such matters. James left her all the gathered evidence and left, knowing his mission was complete. Now, Robert would get what he deserved. That same evening, when Laura returned home, James was ready. He silently showed her the suitcases by the door. James, what does this mean? She asked, frightened. It means you no longer live here, he replied coldly. I won't let you destroy our life. The kids stay with me. Laura tried to argue, begged him, but James remained firm. He kept his calm, but his decision was final. If this is not my child, you'll never see me or our kids again, he said as she was leaving the house. Amanda acted quickly and decisively. She arranged for a divorce, which became a major scandal in the media. Robert lost not only his wife, but also a significant part of his business and reputation. For James, this was a true victory. A month passed. James had started to adjust to his new life without Laura. One day, she appeared on his doorstep, holding an envelope. James, I know I made a terrible mistake, but you have to see this, she said, handing him the documents. James opened the envelope. It was the DNA test results. The letter stated that he was the father of the child Laura had been pregnant with. "It's your child, James," she said, tears in her eyes. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want this child to have a family." James stared at the results for a long time before looking up at Laura. His heart was torn between anger and love. He knew that making a choice wouldn't be easy. "If you want to come back, Laura," he said finally, "you'll have to prove that you've changed. This time, I won't forgive another mistake." She nodded, her eyes full of hope. They began to work on rebuilding their relationship, but now everything was different. James remained strong and cautious. Laura did everything she could to regain her husband's trust. Eventually, they became a family again. But this story would forever leave a mark on their lives. Do you think it is possible to truly forgive betrayal when it involves family and an unborn child? Was James' decision to give Laura a second chance the right one?